Thank you, sir, and thank you, NASL, for inviting me and giving me an opportunity to talk about acute kidney injury in ACLF and how is it different. So I'm sorry because I'll show most of the work which we've done in this area, and I'll show some concepts which we believe how acute kidney injury is different in acute on chronic liver failure. So this is going to be the outline of my talk. And basically, we know that, again, there is a lot of debate about how you define ACLF. And because we are discussing acute kidney injury, what I just need to emphasize here is that when you understand acute on chronic liver failure, you just need to understand that these patients will have an acute insult, which could be hepatotropic or non-hepatotropic, which varies between different societies and different definitions. The background chronic liver disease can either be compensated or decompensated patients with cirrhosis who are asymptomatic or symptomatic with the disease. And the components of liver failure will include jaundice, coagulopathy, and ascites. And again, extrahepatic organ failures, amongst which the brain and the kidneys are included in the definition by the APASL and EASL. So kidneys are also considered as a part of the definition by different societies, but APASL does not consider. So why we say ACLF is different? Because again, these patients have very high mortality. They need an expedited liver transplant, but again, if you do your measures, appropriate management and identification of and management of the organ failures, you can also achieve a reversibility of the syndrome. So the pathophysiologic basis of acute kidney injury in patients with acute on chronic liver failure basically revolves around three pathogenetic mechanisms which are key over here. That is ischemia, which is again due to macrocirculatory dysfunction. There is endothelial dysfunction, oxidative stress, and impairment of the coagulation. There is intensity of systemic inflammation, which is mediated by the damage associated and the pathogen associated molecular patterns. And this drives AKI and other organ failures in these patients. And again, direct toxic injury to the renal tubules, which again is not different for patients with ACLF and decompensated, which we know due to nephrotoxic agents, contrast agents, but particularly in patients with ACLF, bile acids are something which is of clinical relevance. So when you look at the spectrum of AKI in patients with acute and chronic liver failure, and I would like to highlight this revised definition of hepatorenal syndrome, which has been an initiative by the International Club of Ascites and the Acute Dialysis Quality Initiative Group. And this becomes very relevant in the context of ACLF patients when we are diagnosing HRS, and also in the context of metabolic associated steatotic liver disease, where you have a large number of patients who have background CKD. So now we say that HRS conceptually is an AKI which occurs in a patient who has advanced cirrhosis, has ascites, but it may still occur on a background of tubular injury or chronic kidney disease. So again, we have evolved with the defining of AKI, and we have removed the absolute value of serum creatinine, and we've incorporated the urine output criteria in defining AKI HRS. Another very big step is that we have removed the timeline of 48 hours, so you need not wait for 48 hours to make the diagnosis of HRS, and within a span of 24 hours, if you've done an appropriate volume expansion, you may still go ahead and make a diagnosis and start your vasoconstrictors. And again, there should be an absence of a strong evidence for an alternative explanation for the AKI, for instance, severe septic shock, drug-induced AKI, or intrinsic kidney disease. So long ago, we showed that in patients with acute and chronic liver failure, so when you compare the two cohorts, why we are saying ACLF is different. So these two cohorts, this was acute decompensation, and all these patients were having prior decompensated cirrhosis and had presented again with jaundice and coagulopathy. So if you look at the baseline characteristics of the two cohorts, despite being jaundice, we see here ACLF patients were more deeply jaundiced with a bilirubin of 21. They had higher AST and ALT ratio, which was significant, higher markers of systemic inflammation. And again, on urine microscopy, we showed that these patients had more structural AKI, rapid progression, and requirement of renal replacement therapy. And cholemic nephropathy, again, unfortunately, even though we are seeing very often in these patients with acute and chronic liver failure, we're not able to diagnose it because the problem is you need a histology, and it's very difficult to do a renal biopsy in an ACLF patient who has severe AKI. So that's the major challenge. But when you look at the animal data from bile duct ligated animal models, it has been clearly shown that this kind of nephropathy is mediated by the toxic effects of the bile salts. They cause distal damage to the renal tubules, which starts at the distal collecting ducts, goes to the proximal collecting ducts. And these patients have an increased expression of aquaporin 2, these animals. And again, very importantly, they rapidly progress in a span of 2 to 3 weeks to tubulointerstitial fibrosis. Again, highlighting that inflammation and this bile salt related nephropathy is driving rapid progression to renal fibrosis. This was another very interesting study, again looking at the kidney biopsies in patients who were deeply jaundiced. And again, when you see here, 85% of the patients who had bile cast were actually diagnosed by the managing clinicians as hepatorenal syndrome. And we can see here patients who did not have bile cast versus those who had bile cast, again, they were more deeply jaundiced. So more deep jaundice is one signifier to say that you're dealing with coulommic nephropathy. And why we want to make this distinction is again a very important question. So when you look at these post-mortem kidney biopsies, and this is the data where we analyzed 61 such patients of ACLF who had died of stage 3 AKI, it was very interesting to see that even though these patients had died of multi-organ failures and shock, 60% had coulommic nephropathy rather than having features of acute tubular necrosis. So this was the more dominant phenotype that was seen in these post-mortem kidney biopsies. And when we did the immunohistochemistry, we found that the marker of mitochondrial biogenesis, SIRTUIN-1, was overexpressed in coulommic nephropathy histology patients as against the patients with ATN had an increased expression of hypoxia-inducible factor. So again signifying that there is a different pathogenetic mechanism of how these two structural phenotypes of AKI different in these patients. And what are the indirect surrogates? Because we cannot do and we should not be waiting for the patients to die to make that diagnosis of coulommic nephropathy. So what we can look at is look at the serum bilirubin. When we saw these patients were deeply jaundiced with bilirubin above 30 as compared to ATN. But again, ATN patients were also deeply jaundiced. So they also had a bilirubin in the range of 25 to 28. But when you look at the urine microscopy, there was presence of bilirubin crystals in bile cast, which was not seen in patients who had acute tubular necrosis. And why again this distinction is important? Because when you are dealing with a patient of ACLF with stage 3 AKI who is deeply jaundiced, either having ATN or coulommic nephropathy, and you're making a diagnosis of HRS, only 20% of these patients will respond, and you have to use an adjunctive therapy in the form of extracorporeal therapy or a renal replacement therapy timely in these patients rather than waiting to improve their outcomes. So this distinction is therefore important. So we went ahead with the urine microscopy data, and what we did was we stratified these patients based on the urine microscopy into distinct phenotypes, and then we did a complete urine cytokine array analysis of all the important biomarkers of injury, repair, and tubular fibrosis. So we can see here in the principal component analysis that patients with ATN had a distinct profile, so was coulommic nephropathy, HRS patients, and patients with no AKI. So ATN was distinctly different while coulommic nephropathy and HRS was quite close. So when you look at the other markers, it is again very interesting to see here that markers of tubular injury, despite the coulommic nephropathy being a structural AKI, the NGAL and renin were distinctly lower as compared to ATN. However, the renal repair markers were higher in these patients as compared to ATN. They were almost comparable to patients who had HRS. When you look at the plasma cytokine, and this is the heat map analysis looking at all the plasma cytokines, we can see here distinctly patients with coulommic nephropathy had higher pro-inflammatory cytokines, while patients with ATN had a suppressive phenotype. So they were having immunosuppression based on the cytokine data. When we looked at the bile acids, again, bile acids were elevated more often in coulommic nephropathy and ATN, but markedly elevated in coulommic nephropathy. The DAMP molecules, endotoxin, and the endothelin-1 were almost comparable between coulommic and ATN. And these were again biopsy-proven cases, and we can see here again increased expression of aquaporin 2 in coulimic nephropathy patients versus ATN. SGLT, which is again a marker of tubular repair, was upregulated in coulimic as compared to ATN, and sirtuin-1 and HIF1, as I already mentioned. Now, again, a very important part was coulimic nephropathy. When you see these patients and compare them with the ATN patients, what is distinctly different is the mitochondrial function. So when we did using the Seahorse bioanalyzer, we looked at the PBMCs and we looked at the mitochondrial function. We found that in patients with coulimic nephropathy as compared to ATN, there was preservation of the mitochondrial function. And when you look at the RT-qPCR from the renal tubules and look at the expression of these genes of mitochondrial biogenesis, they were overexpressed in coulimic nephropathy as against patients with ATN. So we go back again to the indirect surrogate. So we've understood there is a distinct entity as compared to ATN, but how do we make a clinical diagnosis? So apart from looking at the bilirubin level, what we need to add is to look at the measurement of serum bile acids, and maybe a urine NGAL level can add on to whether you are dealing with a purely functional AKI, which is HRS, or you're dealing with structural AKI. And if your bile acids are very high, more often you're dealing with a coulimic nephropathy. We also looked at the mass spec data and showed a clear distinction in patients who were terlipressin non-responders versus responders. So non-responders are more likely to be having either coulimic or ATN. You find that there is a distinct profile of bile acids. And based on the animal data, if we go, whatever we found significant has already been shown. These bile acids have been shown to be toxic to the mitochondria. So again, we go back to the same story that there is something which is there in the renal tubules and the blood, that these patients, the host response is different, even though in the presence of severe systemic inflammation, they are driving a renal tubular injury which is distinctly different from the ATN group. Now, another interesting thing in the same set of patients, what we did was to look at how does these serum bile acids, apart from affecting the renal dysfunction, correlate with the other extrahepatic organ dysfunction, and we found that it was correlating significantly with the next organ that was of importance was circulatory dysfunction, and we did not find any correlation with cerebral or pulmonary, again suggesting you get circulatory dysfunction and renal dysfunction because of these toxic bile acids. Now, what is the implication of diagnosing or making this diagnosis in the clinical practice? Because we are dealing with a high non-response rate, like I already mentioned. So the strategy, one, to improve the outcomes of HRS-AKI is to start incorporating the KDIGO criteria, target an appropriate MAP. The second strategy is not to wait for AKI progression. So start assessing your patient every 6 to 12 hourly. If you have a persistent of AKI, start early terlipressin, and this is a randomized control trial again from our group, where we showed that early initiation of terlipressin in the first 12 hours of appropriate volume expansion can improve HRS outcomes. But still, we are using a continuous infusion of terlipressin over norepinephrine, and this again the data from our center from the RCT. But again, by the end of 2 weeks, 60% of these patients, even those who have an initial response, go on to the requirement of dialysis. So what do we have for such patients? Therapeutic plasma exchange is one such strategy because we are looking at systemic inflammation and bile acids as key drivers. But again, we have to be very cautious of using plasma exchange late in the course of the disease where it is associated. And again, it correlates in the patients who respond. We showed in this particular study that it was improving the mitochondrial function. And we've shown that there's high mortality associated. So all these patients were in the intensive care unit of ACLF who underwent plasma exchange. And when we looked at the predictors, if you're doing plasma exchange in sepsis-induced organ failures or 2 or more organ failures, the outcomes are very poor. So you need to be careful in such patients. So what do we have for such patients? An early initiation of continuous renal replacement therapy, which is a much safer modality. And we've shown in this RCT that there is an improvement in the hemodynamics if you start early on in septic shock and stage 3 AKI and ACLF. And you can obviously, once you improve the shock, you're able to improve the renal outcomes because these 2 organs are closely connected. Heme adsorption is another strategy we're using very often. This data comes again from our RCT, from our center, where we showed that the reduction in bilirubin and bile acids is more effective with heme absorption with a lower incidence of adverse effects. And again, with the bile acid profiling, with the mass spec, we showed that it was reducing the number of toxic bile acids and the reduction was more sustained as compared to plasma exchange and standard medical treatment. DILIV is another exciting strategy which can be tried, again in ATN set of patients. And why again on follow-up the implication, this is my last slide, is the implication on subsequent kidney health. So we know that now we are seeing de novo CKD, which is seen in 25 to 30% of decompensated cirrhosis, and critically ill, almost 50% get this. But in ACLF, we do not know what is the data, but we expect that very high prevalence should be there. I would recommend for all of you to read this APASL guidelines, which we have developed with the help of all the key global experts on how to manage acute kidney injury in patients with acute and chronic liver failure. So I would like to summarize by saying that yes, AKI and ACLF is very different. It's rapidly progressive, has different pathogenetic mechanism. The non-response rates are very high, and there are different mechanisms which drive this non-response, which need to be measured and understood in our patients. We need multicentric RCTs looking at these non-invasive markers, and also to look at the outcomes of non-HRS, the patients who are non-responders to terlipressin, and obviously the expedited liver transplant remains the treatment of choice. Thank you.